The council chamber smelled like recycled air and old decisions. 7 species, 43 seats, and not one of them looked me in the eye when the head arbiter read the verdict. I had learned early in my diplomatic career that when people stop meeting your gaze, you have already won the argument. They just haven't admitted it yet. My name is Marcus Hale. For 11 years I served as Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council, which is a long way of saying I spent 11 years watching powerful people do dishonest things and writing very detailed reports about it. The last report I wrote was 412 pages long. It proved, with annotated evidence from 6 independent data sources, that the Keth Accords, the Council's most celebrated achievement, their proof that 30 species could cooperate peacefully, were built on forged population records. 3 species had been quietly removed from their home regions. The Council called those regions development zones. The people who had lived there called them home. The Council called my report destabilizing content. I called it a census. They could not execute me. The trial was broadcast across 17 star systems, and 32 billion people were watching, so they did the next best thing. They exiled me to Dulcara, a tidally locked desert world with no orbital infrastructure, no supply lines, and a survival record of exactly 0. They loaded me onto a cargo skiff with 32 kilos of gear, a standard atmospheric suit, and a set of coordinates pointing to a rock shelf on the dayside terminator. The arbiter wished me good fortune with the tone of someone who wished me nothing of the sort. I spent the entire flight memorizing the skiff's hull composition, fuel cell type, and descent angle. The guard watching me thought this was sad. I thought it was efficient. Dulcara hits you in the face the moment the hatch opens. The Terminator Ridge, the narrow strip between the burning day side and the frozen night side, is swept by thermal winds strong enough to lean into, permanent and howling, carrying fine red dust that coats everything within minutes. The light is orange and flat, caught permanently at something like late afternoon, and the landscape is all broken shale and iron-colored rock as far as the eye can reach. Nothing moves except the wind and the dust. I stood there for approximately 30 seconds, taking stock. Then I opened my pack and got to work. The fuel cell from the cargo skiff was a standard council issue unit, which meant it was designed to be reliable, not clever. I had a diplomatic multi-tool, which is the kind of object that gets issued to ambassadors because it looks professional, and no one expects you to actually use it. The third setting modulates discharge rates. Most people never find the third setting. I had found it 6 years ago during a posting on a gas giant mining platform, out of boredom, during a very long arbitration session. By the end of day 1, I had a functional heating element, a windbreak assembled from hull plating, and a small moisture condenser pulling water from the thin air. Not comfortable, but workable. And workable, in my experience, is always the first step toward good. I found them on day 2. Velsha was the first. She was sitting behind a flat shelf of rock on the eastern edge of the ridge, very still, watching me approach with the focused attention of someone deciding whether to run. She was Sarathi, tall, 6-limbed, covered in copper-colored scales that caught the orange light and threw it back in small, warm flashes. Her species had heat-sensing pits along their jawline, which meant she had known exactly how warm I was and in which direction I was moving for a long time before I saw her. She had been on Dulcara for 8 months. 8 months alone, on a world with no infrastructure and no company, surviving on condensed moisture and sharp intelligence. She had been exiled for publishing astronomical data suggesting the Council's primary communication relay network was also a weapons targeting system. She had been right. That was, of course, the problem. I sat down about 3 meters away, opened my pack, and started disassembling a secondary component of the fuel cell. She watched me. After a while, she asked what I was doing. I told her I was expanding the heating element's radius. She said the secondary coil would short without a buffer. I said I was using the inner lining of the suit's collar as a buffer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she moved 3 meters closer and watched more carefully. I found Zin an hour later, tucked into a narrow crack in the shale, folded as small as she could make herself. She was Durathi, small and delicate, with membrane wings pressed flat against her back, and a bioluminescent layer beneath her skin that glowed faintly blue in calm moments, and flickered amber when she was anxious. She was anxious constantly, which made her glow like a small worried lantern. She had refused to give false testimony against her crew during a council trade investigation. That was her crime. She was, by any legal standard, a protected witness who should never have faced consequences. The council had shipped her here anyway, and apparently considered the matter resolved. I introduced myself. She didn't respond for a long moment. Then she asked if I had food. I gave her half of what I had planned for dinner. She accepted it with both hands, and ate quickly, watching me the entire time with large, dark eyes. And I understood that she had not eaten properly in days. Oriva was 200 meters further west, moving slowly along the ridge in a way that made my chest tighten when I understood why. She was Tylan, roughly bipedal, but built for low-gravity environments, with a secondary skeletal frame that was elegant on her homeworld and a source of constant pain here. Dulcara's gravity was 60% higher than anything her body had been designed for. Every step cost her. She had been a xenobiologist. She had catalogued 3 sapient microbial species in a region the council had already licensed for mineral extraction. The species had been destroyed. Oriva had filed the documentation anyway. The council's response was to classify her findings and classify her. Despite everything, when I introduced myself and explained what I was building, she immediately began calculating load tolerances and wind resistance figures in her head, and telling me which of my structural decisions were suboptimal. She was completely right about all of them. I adjusted accordingly, and she looked, very briefly, like someone who had been heard for the first time in months. Tsai I found at dusk, sitting on a flat rock and reading something on a personal device so old, it was clearly personal property rather than anything issued. She was Makari, close enough to humanoid in shape that it took a moment to notice the differences, and one of those differences was the way her skin shifted through slow, iridescent patterns, cycling through colors the way humans shift expressions. She watched me approach with the patience of someone who had spent years in rooms where everything happened slowly, and the person who moved first always lost. She had been a legal advocate, one of the best in 3 systems, by reputation. She had won a case that cost a powerful council family 2 trade routes and a significant portion of their political standing. Here she was. I sat down beside her. She looked at me. I looked at her skin, which was cycling through deep blues and quiet greens, which I would later learn meant careful assessment. I told her I was building a heat source and a water system, and that there was room for 5 people if she wanted to come back with me before the temperature dropped. She stood up and came with me, without another word. She was, as I said, someone who understood when the argument was already settled. The weeks that followed were not easy. They were, however, interesting. I had spent 11 years as a diplomat, which sounds like a soft profession, until you realize that diplomacy requires understanding how every kind of system works well enough to navigate it, and that this habit of understanding systems does not turn off when the system in question is a hostile desert world. I had atmospheric chemistry knowledge from a gas giant posting. I had structural improvisation experience from 3 years with a nomadic species that built and dismantled shelters daily. I had medical triage certification and an unconditional inability to accept that a problem had no solution. The moisture condenser expanded. The heating element became a proper thermal bank, built with hull plating angled to catch the dayside radiation and store it through the cold cycles. The windbreak became walls. The walls became a shelter. The shelter became, over time, a place that felt not quite like home, but like somewhere that had decided to keep us. Velsha started helping with the construction on day 5, because she was a physicist, and the engineering problems were interesting, and her brain would not let her ignore interesting problems. We worked in comfortable silence for long stretches, which suited us both. She had a way of positioning herself that I noticed only gradually, angling slightly toward me, a Sarathi behavior that meant protective attention, that her species showed toward people they had decided mattered. I did not mention it. I appreciated it quietly. Zin stopped sleeping in the crack in the shale and started sleeping near our shelter after I built her a small, dedicated light source, calibrated to match her bioluminescent wavelength, so she could see herself glow and know she was still whole. She did not thank me in words. She started saving me the better portions at meals, which was a more honest currency anyway. Oriva could not move easily, but she could think faster and more precisely than anyone I had ever worked with. She became the planning mind of everything we built. While I worked with my hands, she ran the numbers. Her species had evolved for collaborative cognition, designed to share complex models rapidly between individuals. With me, She adapted to a slower rhythm, and I learned to listen like my memory depended on it, because it did. Tessai watched all of us and said relatively little until the third week, when she caught me rereading my Keth Accord files on my archive chip late in the evening. She asked if I was still fighting that case. I said I had never stopped. She was quiet for a long time, watching the thermal winds move across the ridge in the orange half-light. Then she asked if she could see the files. She was, after all, a lawyer. On day 43, the communications array we had built from the skiff's navigation antenna and Ariva's survey equipment picked up an encrypted council channel. Velsha decoded it. Tessai read the legal language. Oriva mapped the trajectory data embedded in the signal, and Zine, who could fly low and fast in the dark with her bioluminescence completely damped, scouted the eastern ridge before dawn and confirmed what we had already understood. The council had sent a retrieval team. Not for all of us, for me. My original Keth Accord documentation had been circulating through academic and journalistic networks for weeks. 7 species ambassadors had formally requested an audit. The council could not survive an honest audit while I was alive and reachable. A retrieval team meant that alive and reachable was about to change. I told the 4 of them, clearly and without softening it, that this was my problem, and they had no obligation to be part of what came next. I told them they could stay in the shelter, stay out of sight, and be clear of whatever happened. Velsha translated this for the group, with an expression that communicated, without a single word, that she found the suggestion remarkable in its optimism. We had 6 days. Velsha spent them mapping every thermal wind pattern on the eastern approach, identifying which routes the retrieval team could not safely navigate without equipment they did not have. She did this with professional satisfaction and zero visible anger, which was somehow more impressive than fury would have been. Zine ran nightly reconnaissance, moving in the dark below the ridgeline, silent and invisible, returning each morning with exact positions and movement patterns. She had been terrified of the dark when she arrived. She was not terrified anymore. Oriva built a geological hazard map of the retrieval team's most likely landing zone from the survey data she had gathered in her first weeks on the ridge. The ground in that zone was not as stable as it appeared from orbit. She documented this with scientific precision and a calm that I found deeply reassuring. Tessai wrote, she had been building something quietly for weeks, and now she assembled it completely. A legal brief, thorough and airtight, incorporating my Keth Accord data, her own analysis, and documented accounts from each of us, time-stamped by our array's recorded signals. She addressed it to the 7 ambassadors who had requested the audit. She prepared it for transmission, and told me exactly how much antenna power we would need, and exactly when the council relay would be positioned to carry the signal cleanly. I built the antenna extension. It took 2 days, and I was very precise about it. The retrieval team landed in a formation that assumed no resistance. This was a reasonable thing to assume about a single unarmed diplomat on a world where nothing survived. They moved toward the ridge in a standard approach pattern, confident and unhurried. The first approach route they tried was swept by a thermal wind surge that Velsha had modeled to within 4 minutes. They pulled back and tried the second route. The landing zone on the second route had a stability problem that Oriva had documented to within 4 meters. They adjusted again, slower now, less certain. Zin had told us exactly where they would be at each decision point. We were never where they expected, and when they committed to the final approach, when their communications array was pointed away from the council relay at exactly the angle Tessai had calculated, we transmitted. The brief reached all 7 ambassadors within minutes. It included everything: the original Keth Accord data, the legal analysis, the astronomical evidence, and the recorded authorization of a kill mission against an exiled individual whose crime was submitting accurate documentation. The ambassadors, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence, moved immediately. The retrieval team's squad leader received a hold order before her team cleared the ridge. She stood very still for a moment, reading her communication device, and then she looked up and found me standing in the orange half-light with 4 women behind me who were supposed to be dead. I had thought many times about what I would say in that moment. In the end, I said nothing. I just looked at her until she stopped looking back. The audit took 4 months. 3 council members resigned before it concluded. The Keth Accords were suspended pending full review, which everyone understood meant they were finished in their current form. The populations that had been displaced were acknowledged formally and officially, which was not justice, but was the necessary beginning of it. Dulcara was reclassified, not as a dead world, as an inhabited one, which triggered a specific set of protections under statutes the Council had written themselves, and apparently forgotten. I was offered reinstatement to the diplomatic corps. I thought about it for a week, sitting on the ridge with Velsha working beside me, and Zin drifting into her familiar spot near my side in the evening, and Ariva running calculations I hadn't asked for but always needed, and Tessai watching me think with the patient attention she gave to every problem worth her time. I sent back a polite and permanent refusal. I had been assigned to a dead world and made it into something worth staying in. There were 14 ongoing problems on the ridge that still needed solving. The atmospheric chemistry was genuinely interesting, and I had 4 people I would rather work alongside than anyone the diplomatic corps had ever introduced me to. The Council had exiled me to a place where nothing survived. They had calculated this carefully. What they had failed to account for was that survival rates are, at their core, just statistics about people who had already given up. And I have never, in my entire life, been that person.